Hey everyone, Coach Mike here, and welcome back to another episode of the Language of Leadership podcast. We are so lucky today to be joined by Martina Lauchengco. Martina, you've had a legendary career spanning over 30 years as a marketing and product executive, building, branding, and launching market-defining software at luminary companies like Microsoft, Netscape AOL, and Loud Cloud Opsware. You've served on the boards of directors and advisory boards at over a dozen startups. And in addition to serving as a partner at Costanoa Ventures, you're also a partner at Silicon Valley Product Group and a lecturer on marketing and product management at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Engineering. Thank you so much for joining us today. How's everything going over there in sunny California?
Mike, thank you so much for having me. It is actually a beautiful day in San Francisco.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, you've just recently published an amazing book, Loved, which we're going to jump into in a moment. We're going to get to unpack some of the great thoughts and sharings and unique insights you have on product marketing. But before we get there, Martina, could you share with our viewers and audience a little bit more about your background and how you got to where you are today?
I am the daughter of two immigrants. I have a German mother and a Filipino father. I'm second of four kids, so I'm a middle child, which I think forged me in so many ways. My older sister was one of those naturally brilliant, amazing people that got into every university she applied to, like Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Georgetown. I mean, it was gross. And I was the younger sister that was always striving to be close to my older sister. And I bring that up just because I do feel like that was very foundational in who I am and how I show up in the world, which is for better or for worse. I always compared myself to my older sister and felt I need to work really, really hard to be half as good as her. And so I developed different skills, which were not necessarily academically. I mean, obviously, academically, I did fine, but I felt like I just needed to lean in and be engaged with the world. And in retrospect, now that I see our lives, I realize, oh, that worked really. Like the two middle kids who were much more relationally focused, we have done fine in life. And so that has been super instructive in me as a human being and how I operate in the world.
Well, as someone who has an older sister who I also admire, I know that it can be a little bit daunting, but it's very clear that all of the successes and all that are to come are still incredibly impressive from what you've done so far, Martina. I just glossed over all the amazing professional successes that you've had, but before then, you were also a collegiate national cycling champion. I'd love to dive into this. What does it take to become a champion at such a high level at an athletic event like cycling?
Well, I actually went through high school and my first year in college as a runner. And my consolation prize was, oh, I think I'll try triathlons. And then a friend of mine mentioned, oh, since you're getting on a bike, you might as well try riding with the Stanford cycling team so you get to know something about bikes. And I just fell in love with the community. And I would say the big thing to do something at that level is you have to really like the community you're a part of. If you're just doing it for the sake of achievement, it's just not going to be fun or interesting and you won't devote the time. And then it did take, so I was doing cycling as part of triathlons for much of the start of my cycling career. I'm at the very towards the end when we basically came in third at nationals, and someone said, you know what, Martina, if you really want to get to that next level, you're going to have to be fully committed to cycling as a sport, which meant giving up some of the things that I loved for that period of time so that I could succeed at that next level. And so it required me being a focused cyclist and giving up some of the other sports that I loved and putting in a lot of miles and also working extremely diligently with my teammates. We were national champions in a discipline called team time trialing. And most people would just put their top riders together and then do the event. And we would practice the event every single week. And so our communication with one another was seamless. We could, from behind one another, we could anticipate, you know what, this person's fallen off pace. And so we could tell them, move off. And so we just became this unbelievable unit. And to this day, we still get together every other year and like have mad love for one another because it brought us so close. But we just practiced so diligently and got to know one another so that we were at that next level of team. And I'd say that's what it took for us to get to that level.
Super impressive, not only to win the national championship, but also to develop that level of trust and faith and mutual support with your colleagues and teammates.
Yes.
Certainly a meaningful leadership experience. Were there any other leaders or influences, maybe beyond your older sister, in your young adult life or in your early professional life that you would point to as someone who you say, wow, that person really influenced my leadership journey in a positive way?
I would say Oprah Winfrey really positively influenced me because I felt like, well, there were two in school. It was one of my professors who, I mean, I came from a very achievement oriented family, and there were all these things I felt like I should do. And my favorite professor of all time had office hours. And I went to one of those office hours and I said, Professor, I hear all these things that you're saying, but I'm trying to figure out how to do all these other things that I'd like to do. And he just looked at me and said, Martina, it seems like you have an overdeveloped guilt complex. And no one had put it that way. And I was like, oh, it's me that's holding me back. I thought it was me doing all the things I should do. And he's like, no, just do those other things. So that was huge. And realizing, and someone pointing out to me that I respected that sometimes you're in your own way. And then in terms of aspiring to be like, wow, look at this, all this person has accomplished by being their authentic self, that was really Oprah, who just modeled a different style of leadership, which was very connective, very human, very vulnerable, and I just didn't see a lot of that on display growing up. And so I'd say someone unleashing me from my own uh, overdeveloped sense of duty or what things should, the shoulds, letting go of the shoulds, and then seeing an example of someone who is showing up as a complete human being and how much more powerful as a leadership example that was than any of the other models I had seen. So those were the two biggest ones in my early career.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Very different, and at the same time, both increasing vulnerability and authenticity. And it also sounds like just very distinctive styles as well. Yeah.
Yeah, well, my father growing up was in the army, and so his version of leadership and that which I thought was the best growing up was very authoritative. You become an expert, you get a position, and you basically are a very respected leader from that position. But it was positional authority and not relational authority or influence. And I'd say the big shift that I leaned toward in my 20s, and I had to learn a lot of this, was how do you create position, how do you create relational and emotional influence where you don't have positional authority? And as a leader, that ultimately becomes much more important over time, especially as you rise up in organizations. And so I had to learn that and also experience it.
What a seamless transition, Martina, into loved, because when one is a product marketer, we or excuse me, when one practices the product marketing discipline, whether or not your official role in the organization is a product marketer, one of the themes that I gathered from the book is having that influence cross functionally, vertically, 360 in a way that doesn't necessarily require a positional role of authority, but one of expertise and influence. Could you
Yes.
share with the audience and the viewers a little bit more about your book, Loved? It's a tremendous book about product marketing. It's it has the frameworks and value you would expect from a textbook, but is presented in such a conversational and readable tone. What led you to write the book, and what's the core driving thesis behind it?
Well, what led me to write the book was this general lack of understanding of how powerful product marketing, when practiced well, can be in bringing a product to market. And product marketing as a discipline was getting confused with manage a bunch of tasks, do these 37 things, write the marketing messaging for this product. And that's a small part of what it can be. It's actually, when it's done well, it's highly strategic. It can dramatically influence how a product succeeds in its market. And it just became clear over my 30 years that people really didn't understand the potential for the role. And I think they also thought you need the savior or product marketer to do it, when really it's this collaboration among all of the go-to-market and product teams that make great product marketing happen. So I wanted the world to understand that. So that's what motivated the book.
And Martina, can you unpack for us what does great product marketing look like? Not all of us have had the pleasure of working at both large and medium-sized companies. As you've done, you've helped redefine the world of word processing and software at Microsoft, helped redefine browsers at Netscape, helped redefine infrastructure software at Loud Cloud Opsware, and now at Costanoa Ventures and Silicon Valley Product Group. I know that you're on the board and advising many other founders and product leaders and marketing leaders. So not all of us have had that wealth of experience that you've had. What does excellent product marketing look like? And if I can trouble you to really put it in a frame that even I could understand, or maybe someone who's just starting their career, or a young professional.
Yeah, well, I think you and I, before we started, were talking about something like YouTube, something that you use every day. And right now, I'm the Warriors, my hometown team, is battling it out with the Celtics at the NBA basketball finals. And every other ad break, it's YouTube TV promoting the fact that their package of live events, obviously they are sponsoring basketball, their package of live events is equivalent to cable, but at a fraction of the cost. So product marketing is deciding what is the position that our product should hold and what are we packaging with it. So what are the services that we need to have? So it's not just what's technically enabled, but it's how many things do we need to bundle into this at what price to make sure that it's a compelling offering relative to all these other over-the-top services, so that someone would choose YouTube TV over any other that they have. And then that position that they're honing in on one, which is relative to the bill you pay, it's the same, it's roughly the same of the things that you care about. So it's not everything, it's the things you care about at a fraction of the cost. The team decided that's the position that we need to hold that will acquire us the most users at this moment in time. And so someone had to decide who is that initial customer base from which we believe that we can grow. And so they might have also said it's sports fans, which is why we should make sure the time in which we are promoting ourselves heavily is when we have sports events, and we should also sponsor sports events so people start to associate us with one of the few things they care about having in real time, which is events. And so let's make sure that we are perceived as a player in this space, and we might have to spend disproportionately relative to where we are in terms of user acquisition or what we're making off of it. But it's that important for us to occupy the space in the market. All of that is product marketing. It is not all only done by the product marketers in a company, but figuring all these elements out and working dynamically and then creating that plan to bring the product to market within that is what a product marketer would direct.
And as you write in the book, the product marketer or the product marketing discipline needs to wear a few different hats. They have the ambassador hat, the strategist hat, the storyteller hat, and the evangelist hat. Could you help us unpack what the difference between those different roles are?
Yeah. So I described it as those four fundamentals to help people understand that irrespective of who carries the title or the role, these are the things that must be done for your product to be understood within the market. And that first fundamental, as you mentioned, was the ambassador, which is connecting the customer and market insights to the product. And I very intentionally phrased it that way, which is not like, hey, bring your product to the market. It's the inverse of that. What's the market actually, what's happening in the market? What is the market appetite for this? And then let's somehow integrate that into where we want our product to sit. So it's combining those insights. So that's the ambassador. And it's inside a company. It's aligning what's happening on the product, the go-to-market engine, with what's happening with the product that's being built. The second fundamental is the strategist, which is directing that product's go-to-market through a series of strategic marketing actions. It might not be all of them, but it's do we sponsor all of the NBA or have a gold sponsorships across every event, or is it just the finals, or is it just the broadcast? And what's most important to us strategically? And then who do we need to align ourselves with? Is it the NBA versus the NFL versus NHL? So an example there is the NBA combined has more social followers than all the other major leagues in the United States combined because they let their video rights be freely used and shared. So YouTube looks at that and says, well, where do we have the most alignment? Because it fuels the usage of YouTube. And I'm sure somebody looked at the data and said, well, the NBA. That's an important strategy decision, which says, well, we care about NBA fans, or that's National Basketball Association. We care about the basketball fans because they are the fastest growing, most socially sharing audience that leverages YouTube already. So it's a more logical match. That's strategy. And that's what a strategist understands and then builds building blocks around and how something goes to market. And then that storytelling aspect, which is to shape how the world thinks about your product. That's right now they've decided it's cheaper than cable, and that they're not saying it's the most technologically awesome. It's anytime, anywhere. They've chosen that it's about the value. It's a value message, and that's I'm sure they have really good reasons why they made that decision. And then on the evangelists, they are I am sure that they have contacted a lot of YouTube influencers or people that have used NBA clips heavily, or evangelists that they can enable to help show, hey, this was a YouTube clip or YouTube TV clip, and making sure that those are the bits that are getting circulated out there. Or they might go to the product team and say, hey, let's make sure anything that is a YouTube TV clip gets elevated in the you might also like hierarchy, so people can see that a lot of people are using it as a service. So these are all elements of how they would come together and how that dialogue might occur across product teams and go-to-market teams and people that are actually running sponsorships or spending a lot of money on advertising, and how those four aspects of the product marketing discipline are practiced.
Thank you, Martina. That's so helpful. Let me quickly just play it back to make sure that I and our audience can grapple this. So the ambassador is the one who really inverts and says, rather than going from product to market, it's about taking the market needs and then bringing the product to it. The strategist prioritizes that planning. The storyteller crafts the narrative in this moment in time, and then the evangelist looks to gather the I was going to say the referrals, but the evangelist looks to gather the positive influence that already exists within the market and the surrounding communities to help ensure that the whole thing is a success. Does that sound
Yeah,
about
no,
right?
that's about right. And I'd say the one twist I'd put on that last part is you're making sure you're enabling others to do that evangelism. So you don't have to be the focal point of that. It's just making sure, like the NBA deciding, we are not going to say that these are copyright infringements when people are sharing on YouTube. That was an explicit choice of the NBA because they were trying to enable evangelism. So that's a great example of they didn't do it, they enabled
Mm-hmm.
others to do it.
There's so many micro components and tactical approaches that you describe in the book, and so I encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Love Themselves. And at the end of the episode, let's make sure we can link everybody to where they can pick up the copy of the book. During the book too, I did notice that there were some tensions. There were some more macro level challenges. Maybe you could even describe them as potential contradictions. And I was hoping, Martina, you could help us navigate these. Can we go through a few of those?
You bet.
Okay. So, first is often we hear that first time founders or first time executives are obsessed with making the product. This mindset is we want to make the product so good it should sell itself, right? Elon Musk has Tesla cars and he doesn't have advertising budget, so I can do that too. Second time executives, as the saying goes, are much more conscientious about distribution. So, as a product marketer or as we're going to market, is it all about the product or is it all about the distribution? Or is there some magical middle ground?
Well, for me, I think there's a magical middle ground. You have to have both. If you're not thinking about go to market as you build product, it's really, really difficult. As crowded as every product marketplace is, it's going to be difficult to succeed because you're not going to be standing alone. And someone adjacent to you, above you, next to you, in all these different categories might be saying and doing things that feel equivalent in the market. So if you have clarity on how you want to go to market, it might shape the product that you're going to build. If you think that your go-to-market is going to be more product-led, as an example, versus direct sales, you're going to build a different product that's going to index towards more ease of use, or can somebody share this with somebody else or use it together with a team because we want to really deeply encourage virality. But if you're doing a top-down sale, that you won't need to prioritize that. So the go-to-market motion, as well as what you say and the space in which it falls, that very much should shape product. And one thing that I work with Costanoa startups on a lot is that early messaging, even the earliest stages of a company, can shape roadmap. And an example of that on the Costanoa front is a company that's talking about authorization, which is a highly technical thing about identity management. And it gets confused oftentimes with authentication. But as they were talking back and forth with people and customers trying to understand where to land this and how do we talk about it, is this privileged access management? Is it all these other things? You would get immediately confused. But if they just simplified it to, it's just in time access for the most important things in the right context at the right time, people were like, oh, that makes total sense. And they weren't drawing the fine distinction between authorization versus authentication. They could get to that later. But that then shaped what they were building and what they would emphasize in what they were building to make clear this is how we're delivering against it. And it just stacked everything into a line that made very evident, how does this all add up? So that's why the go-to-market and the product, especially at the early stages, really need to be examined simultaneously.
I think that's not only clear, thank you, Martina, it also reminds me of another tension that pops up in the book, which is the difference between positioning and messaging. I think you point out some people think these words are interchangeable, but they might not be. Can you help us unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, they're definitely used often interchangeably. And I think probably the primary reason was way back in the early days of software when there were like 10 companies and one store could house everything. Positioning was a positioning statement. It was a one-time thing. You didn't have to do all this work. But in the modern era where there are 5.5 million apps, or you can have in a single software category as many solutions as there are cities on the planet Earth in just one software category, your position can't just be what you say about the product, which is the messaging. It has to be all the other things you do to occupy that position that you're trying to hold. So that YouTube example that we were talking about, all those decisions that they made, who do we want to be affiliated with? When are we going to be doing this? Why do we choose to do the things that we do? All of those actions position a product in addition to what you say about it. So it's the sum of all the parts as opposed to just the things that you say. And in the old days, people thought it was just what you said.
Got it. And I think I know what your opinion might be on this, but I'd like to just double check here. What are your opinions, Martina, on the Mad Libs style of coming up with positioning? And by that I mean, our blank built for blank is the best blank in the blank market. Is that a good way of going
Unlike
about
blankety blank. Yeah, so unlike that, this was makes it different. It can be a helpful thought exercise, but it's terrible at generating usable messaging. And I think part of the reason why is it kitchen sinks everything. And then people
it?
believe because everything's together, oh, it must now all stay together. In modern messaging, you really want to hone in on what do people want and have the capacity to hear that helps simply separate what you do from everything else that they're hearing. And sometimes it might be just a very simple entree and a comparison to something that they're more familiar with, a statement about why they should believe you and you're more credible, and then get into the product details. And that's very different, again, than even when I started my career, where we could just talk about products. But the luxury of that is gone because there is so much density in every technology and product space. And so you really just have to hone in on what do they need to hear that makes it credible. It could be 24-hour, 7-day a week, 365 support. That could be the second most important thing for them to hear after you describe what you do. Again, depending on what it is.
So prioritize the key messages at that moment in time the customer needs to hear. We can't just give them all of the information at once.
Yes, yes. And that's very, very hard. I mean, a lot of the teams I work with say like, oh, we also need to say this, and oh, we also need to say this. Like, yeah, that's the second meeting or the second conversation or a page deep.
Yeah.
Don't try and burden your initial messaging with carrying everything for you.
If we can actually dive into this just a moment, Martina, can we take a look over your shoulder or be in the room with you? Let's imagine an engineering team lead or even a CEO comes to you and you're advising them and they say, but Martina, our team worked 3 months to make this feature awesome. We're now SOC 2 compliant, or we now have some really important feature that we did. We have to tell the customers. What might you share with them, or how might you um, persuade them to really focus on one or two core messages instead of all of those 100 bullet points?
Well, it might be, I agree with you that customers need to hear about. So this is where like lean in, don't say like you're wrong. uh, I totally agree. For these five things that we want to talk about, the best place for them to be heard is in release notes, or it's in this weekly update that we send out to customers that this customer success team sends out, because that's where people are expecting it to be. And it's not rising to the level of it's going to move the market. If you believe that it is, help me understand why you think this is going to move or shape the market, because either I misunderstand or we're not at the same place about the market. And then we have ideally dialogue about that. And let's say that SOC 2 compliance was just important for us to check a box, and it's not going to make any difference at the big picture of the market. And say like, okay, so let's make sure this isn't every tool where someone's trying to check those boxes, ticks and ties, every feature list to make sure that anyone that's looking to make sure that it meets their compliance requirements, that that's there. Or it might be this is part of a bigger message about we're enterprise grade, enterprise ready from day one. And there are all these other things. So instead of us talking about SOC 2 and blah, 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 these other things, it's what they really need to hear is that we are enterprise ready right at the start, or totally secure for large companies. And that's the more important thing for them to hear. And so that's where we just get into dialogue about, from the market's perspective and the customer's perspective, what is it that they need to hear that would make them lean in towards adopting.
Mm. So it's acknowledging the suggestion or the work that the team's done, respecting it, and then politely and respectfully suggesting that maybe we communicate it in just a different way.
Yeah, or just what's the market and customer perspective, and then
Yeah.
where do we need to get alignment on that?
And on that, getting the market and customer perspective, I know that there's another tension between watch what the customers do versus listen to what they say. I know that I learned this. Maybe it's informed my opinions a little bit too much as a young man in high school student government. I think we were raising money for a certain nonprofit organization, and I thought everyone would like to donate because they told me that they would. And then in the lunchroom, everyone walked over to the other fundraising table, which was selling brownies. So I was a little bit confused, but I'm curious. What's your take on watch what customers do versus listen to what they say?
Oh, Mike, what I refer to that when I'm teaching my students is the say-do gap. There's what people say they believe, and sometimes it's a romanticized notion of what we think of ourselves, and then there's what people actually do. And I always encourage teams to bias towards anything you can do to try and understand actual action. So whether that's look at actual product data, look at the clicks, but this is then also where you need to apply some judgment, because it can't be the sole thing that is dictating the outcome. Because you might look at actions and clicks and it says of options A, B, or C, C is absolutely preferred unequivocally. It doesn't mean C is the answer. It might mean C was preferred based on A, B, and C, the options that they saw. And this is where the positioning work comes in. But for how we need to be perceived 6 or 12 months from now, even though C was preferred, it doesn't move us enough in the direction where we need to go. So we're going to do a variation of C that helps elevate this thing that they didn't think that's important, but that tells us where else we have to do work to either educate the market or educate influencers, so that it's not just us that's carrying this message, and the industry starts to move along with how we believe what we believe. So that's how you pay attention to what people do, but also exercise judgment on top of it.
Got it. So I know you're a big Star Wars fan. So one can as Yoda might say, feel the force, intuit certain things at the same time as using customer data. Is that fair?
Yeah. So it's basically you want to feel, you don't want to be totally driven by the force. You have to use the force in providing guidance to, so big force fans, it gives you a visibility into the future and a desired state, and that's where you want to use it, as opposed to ignoring the data that's right in front of you. Like, okay, like Darth Vader is walking here, I can't ignore that. So I need to act based on what's right in front of me, but then I also need to know, well, like, I'm watching Obi-Wan Kenobi right now, and it's like, how much are they protecting
Mm-hmm.
Princess Leia? And knowledge of this. No, no spoilers, but because they're like, oh, they might see something. So it's, you have to act with the data that you see that's in front of you, but you also always have to bear that bigger picture in mind.
And with Obi-Wan and Yoda or Leia, experienced Jedi, they've been there before. They have this pattern recognition. And so maybe they feel the Force a little bit more strongly. They're able to
Yes.
make that more intuitive decision. But a younger Jedi who's just training maybe needs to either listen to the older Jedi or look at the data a little bit more. Is that fair?
Yeah. I would say I experienced that direct thing where we did this nationwide study, where we went to focus groups and basically had them stack rank features and say, like, which are the most important ones. And this is in the early internet era where most people wouldn't have ranked internet as important, not even in their top three. They're like, yeah, internet, that's for somebody else. I don't care about that right now. And we had to decide, even though all of the data came back saying it is not one of the three most important things for us to talk about, we had to decide whether or not the industry was moving in that direction and that it was important for us to include it in our top three, even though it wasn't the customer's top three. And I looked at the data saying we should give the customers what they want. And my boss, who was a more learned Jedi, basically said, I hear what you're saying, but this is strategically more important. I think we have to exercise judgment, and we have to include this in one of the three. And it was absolutely the right call. So thankfully he said something, and thankfully I listened.
Well, in our final few minutes here, I want to shift Martina towards leadership in a slightly different way. You've been very gracious to share with us your leadership experiences in companies as an executive, investor advisor, and in product marketing. Now we can shift to leadership within family and communities. Um, I know that you have a family and you have two beautiful daughters. What guidance would you give to them as they grow up in the world with some of the leadership lessons you've learned, either personal leadership lessons or advice that you'd give them in starting their career and finding some meaningful time and space and happiness?
Well, I have a daughter right now who is in college and going out in the workforce, and one is just show up and work hard. And that is so valued by everyone else around you. That by itself is going to give you a tremendous amount of opportunity. And it can't be underestimated how much you being willing to work hard and do whatever is asked of you will be valued by others. So that's like thing one. Thing two is to be open and to show that you're open to learning. I think it's really difficult, and I know I struggled with this early in my career. You want to be as expert as possible, and you want to show that expertise, because that's how you get credibility, and people think that you are good at what you do is by showing expertise. But there is a really challenging line to ride, which is showing that expertise, but also showing openness to continually learn, because that's what lets people tell you things, saying like, hey, you know what, Mike, I know in this meeting you were trying to do this, but this might have been a better way. If you're always expert, it, people are, they're not going to tell you anything because you feel very closed. But if you communicate that openness, or just a willingness to always learn, it's not always explicit. Sometimes it's just in how you carry yourself in meetings. You will get better at whatever you're doing faster, because people will want to add to you and help make you more successful. So finding ways to do that earlier in your career, even though it's really, really hard, I'd say those are two really important hacks for early career.
Amazing, incredibly helpful, incredibly practical. Show up, do the work, be present, support the needs of the company, the organization, the leader you're working with. And then, if I heard you right, Martina, be open to feedback, and solicit it, because that's the way that we grow.
Yeah, absolutely. You're a very good
You
student, Mike.
I've had a lot of practice. I've had a lot of practice. But you also make it very clear, which I appreciate.
Thank
Um,
you.
You are so gracious, Martina, and generous that all the royalties from this book, Loved, which we'll link to below and we'll ask you to just share with us a little bit more about in a second, are being donated to organizations supporting the advancement of women and underrepresented minorities in tech. Could you speak for a moment just about the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging to workplace and our culture, and especially how maybe you've seen that change over the last few years, especially?
The big thing I've seen change is people's awareness around the fact that diverse teams tend to outperform more homogenous ones. And so I don't feel like that's even questioned as much anymore, which is amazing and wonderful. And everyone, I think, has great intentions. It does take really deliberate action to move in that direction. So even Costanoa Ventures, when I joined, there was the EA of my boss and myself. We were the two women, and everyone else was male. And now, as a firm, we're about 15 people, and we're 60% female. So we made this very intentional move toward building up the women in the organization. And now that we're there, it's really easy because people feel, and there's no question, as a firm, we've gotten so much better with more diverse points of view. And so I think part of what happens is when people experience that difference, they realize, oh, there's a huge benefit to this, and lean into it more, which is wonderful and great. But I think getting there, there's a lot more will, but I think getting there also still takes a tremendous amount of collective effort. And so for me, it became important with the book to continue to shine a light on all the intention in the world is insufficient. We need to keep resourcing it explicitly and also continue to talk about it, because it's only if we never stop talking about it that we'll actually get there. So that's why it became important to elevate it, even in my book being out there in the world.
Well, thank you for the amazing work that you're doing, bringing our attention to that and keeping it front of mind. It's obviously something that we might read about or see in the news less today than we might have a year or two ago, but there's still ever present issues that we need to address. And being able to
Yeah.
resource it through your support and the support of your publishers and all the customers of your book, I think is an amazing way to do that.
Thanks, Mike.
Um, Final question for me before we wrap up here is, what do you hope that your legacy is?
Well, simplest level, I hope that my having been on this planet will make others feel that I left it a better place, and every place that I was better. The companies I worked for were better. The industries I worked in were better. So I just hope to be a net positive force everywhere that I've been, in every organization and institution I've been a part of.
Beautiful. Thank you, Martina. Where can we go to learn more about your work?
So my book is available on Amazon. Oh, and it's going to be translated into Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese in
Amazing.
2023. So yeah, it was super exciting that all the Asian languages were the first, which was interesting. That means there's a lot of interest in product marketing in Asian countries. So yay, thumbs up. Available locally on various forms of Amazon, available as a Kindle download on Audible. I don't know about local bookstores in Asia. That might be tougher, but certainly in the United States, it's available in local bookstores. And yeah, martinalauchenco.com is where you'll find out events that I'm at. But Costanoa Ventures is where I do my day work. And then for people that are interested in product marketing workshops, I do those through Silicon Valley Product Group at svpg.com.
Great. Thank you so much, Martina. We'll make sure that all the listeners and viewers can get access to your work there. Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for sharing so openly and transparently and providing to all of us such a great insight into not only product marketing, but effective leadership over the course of a tremendous career. Thank you.
Mike, thank you so much for having me. Thanks for sharing what you do with others.